Hi, this is Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington, and today I thought I would do something just a little bit different. For those of you who are showing up just for this video, just so you know, most of the videos that I do on my channel have to do with guitars and stringed instruments. Specifically like doing repair stuff, tips for players, things like that, and you can feel free to check those out, and if you're just here for the sharpening video, then that's totally cool too. For those of you who are used to my guitar videos and may not find this useful, that's totally cool too. You don't have to watch this one. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show how I sharpen tools and knives here using my sanding boards. These are the precision sanding boards that I usually use for cutting and polishing nuts and saddles and other things that need to be very flat. And the way that these work is that a piece of sandpaper will go onto this board, and there are neodymium magnets here, and when I go ahead and slap these pieces of metal down, the pieces of metal hold that sandpaper down on this piece of MDF, and MDF is a pretty darn flat surface, so it's it's a pretty good way to get a very nice flat sand on something, which is really important when you're sharpening blades. One of the reasons, incidentally, that I would recommend doing this over going out and, say, like buying some Japanese stones, not that there's anything wrong with going out and buying Japanese stones, they're great, but they are very expensive and they require maintenance that I find when talking to people, even people who are like knife aficionados don't oftentimes realize quite what an ordeal they're getting into with getting sharpening tools like that, because those things require care and feeding too. For instance, if you get a Japanese stone, you don't just get one Japanese stone, you actually get two Japanese stones, because part of the process is actually rubbing those two stones together to get a precision flat surface. With this, you don't actually need to go through all that care and feeding, and all of the dullness and kind of filling up that happens on kind of reusable, like cheap sharpening stones and stuff is not a problem with this, because when this gets filled up, you throw it away and you can put another sheet on there. So I use this for sharpening chisels. I use it for sharpening my knives. I use it for sharpening pretty much all of my bladed tools here. And for today's demonstration, I'm actually going to be sharpening one of my daily carry pocket knives, which is just this little buckshot here. Buckshot knives are not necessarily like the super best thing in the world, but I find that they are definitely good enough to be a carry knife, and they do a good job. They keep a good edge. And they're also cheap enough that if I lose this thing or it gets confiscated when I'm going into a show or something, I don't really cry about it, because it's 12 bucks. Anyway, so what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be going from 500 grit down to 1,000 grit, and then using just a little bit of 2,000 grit, and then we're going to be taking this to my buffing wheel. Things that we're going to need here are obviously the flat sanding board. This could be replaced at your home by, like, if you've got a really nice flat kitchen counter, or you've got like a piece of MDF like this. You can use it. I have also found that taking a piece of sandpaper and kind of wrapping it around a screwdriver, say around this part, and using that kind of like a honing steel also works well. But I find that for most purposes this creates a better edge, and so that's what we're going to be using. So, sharpening blades is a pretty precision operation. That is to say, the thing that you are going for is delicate, and it's kind of easy to mess up. So what I'm going to be doing first is I'm going to be moving the paper out to kind of the end of the board here, where I can really kind of get the entire blade on the paper, and I'm going to be taking my knife out. There's a little bit of schmutz on here, and so what I'm going to be doing first is cleaning. I've got no idea what that is. It might be blackberry gunk, because I've been cutting blackberries back from the sidewalk around here just to kind of be a good Samaritan. For those of you who aren't in the Northwest, boy, let me tell you about blackberries for a minute, because blackberries are one of the evilest plants on the face of the planet. If there is a hell, blackberries are what grows there. They are so spiny. Every single part of them is covered with spines. Like, even the leaves are covered with spines. The only thing that isn't covered with spines is the blackberries, which, while tasty, necessitate having the blackberry plant, which is, not something you want. So, yeah, I just used a little bit of naphtha, and now I'm using just a little bit of guitar polish. Cool little tip for you guys. Guitar polish like this Super 77 is actually really great as a general cleaning chemical for all kinds of things. I actually use that for cleaning my glasses, and it does an excellent job. So anyway, so that's mostly clean, clean enough. And if you look close at this blade, you can see the damage that I have done to this, because this is, again, one of my cheaper knives, and I tend to kind of abuse this thing. And so we're going to be doing a lot of work on this guy. So anyway, we've pushed the paper to the edge of the board here, and the first thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to be finding the angle that needs to happen in order to actually sharpen that edge. And so the way that works, now I've got magnets in here which I find actually kind of help with this operation, but what you do is you kind of lean that on there, and then you give it a little bit of a kick in one direction or another. And what you'll notice when you're kind of rocking the blade back and forth is you'll feel it kind of click into place, and then it leaves, and then it clicks into place, and then it leaves. Clicks into place, you go up, clicks into place, you go further down. And when you feel that little click, that's when that angle is resting flat against the board. And that's at the point that you want to actually go in and do your thing. One of the most important things, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of doing this job well, is making sure that you don't create kind of a rounded angle, or you don't create multiple kind of facets of an angle. You want that whole edge to kind of be neat and uniform all the way down. And the other thing that you want to keep in mind as well is that you want to be very careful, especially going around these curves like this. Knives are actually harder to sharpen, in my opinion, than chisels because of these curves and everything that they've got, because you've got to kind of keep this in mind as you're moving around, and it makes it a little bit more difficult. Whereas a chisel, you kind of kick it up and you get to that point where it clicks in, and then you just go for it, and you just keep on doing your thing. And as long as you're not rocking it back and forth and doing some crazy stuff, it creates a pretty good edge. Whereas these guys, you really have to be mindful around these curves. So anyway, so first of all, I'm going to go ahead and put that on there. I'm going to start with the flat part of the blade down here, just because that's easiest. And you also got to be mindful of these little guys, because they'll get in your way. So again, kind of pushing up, coming down, waiting for the point that it's kind of a delicate thing. So don't press too hard when you're doing this. You'll feel it. You'll feel it. So right about there is where I want to be. And this is a pretty rough grit. Again, this is like 500 grit that I'm using here. And I'm following that edge. So you can see that I'm kind of gradually kind of bringing my hand around, and I'm kind of changing where I'm contacting here. So right now I'm contacting here, I was contacting here. I'm just kind of going around, and I'm keeping both hands on it. Keeping both hands on something is kind of just a good rule of thumb way of having more control over the piece or over what you're working with. And so in a case like this where we're trying to be really precise, it's recommendable, in my opinion, to try to get in the habit of handling the blade with two hands. So then we're going to take it up and we're going to look at it, and you can see, well, you may be able to see how uniform that came out. And that's exactly what I want. Now, there's a little bit of kind of dust clinging here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this rag and I'm going to wipe off in the direction of the blade. I find that if you're sharpening on an abrasive surface, it doesn't actually matter which direction you're moving. You can move in circles, you can move kind of in both directions, you can kind of do this thing. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that you're able to keep the blade in the right position in order to create that consistent edge. I have gotten bad advice when I was a child from various people that you only sharpened, away from the sharpened edge, and then that's how you created the sharpened edge, and that's not actually the case when you're using abrasive sanders. There are cases in which you want to keep that in mind, but this isn't one of them. So we've done this side of the blade, and I'm just going to go ahead and check it over to kind of see if these little nicks could use a little bit more work. And the nicks up here definitely could, and so I'm going to go ahead and just kind of work the nose of this knife just a little bit more. And I'm not pushing terribly hard. I'm pushing hard enough that I'm able to make good contact and keep it stable. But I'm not really putting a whole lot of force in here, because I want the sandpaper to be able to do the work. And the other thing is that the harder you press with sandpaper, particularly with finer grits, the more they tend to fill up. And in cases like this where you're trying to take down a fairly hard material like steel, you definitely want to keep that paper as active as possible for as long as possible. So not letting it fill up is a good way to go. Alrighty. So looking at that, there are still some nicks present. Because this is a lower end knife, this is not a knife that I use for precise stuff. I'm not necessarily going to super worry about getting rid of every single one of those nicks. There's this particularly deep one down here that's been there for a while, and it'll, enough of these sharpenings and it will disappear, but probably by that time I will have created new nicks. I think I got that one actually trimming blackberries. I think that one ended up hitting a chain link fence and kind of getting a little nicked. So anyway, we're going to go ahead and take the other side of this knife now. So we've done this side, and we're going to do the same thing. So we're just going to kind of, start with the flat side of the blade, flat part of the blade here, and kind of play with it, kick it up at different angles until we feel it kind of click. And you may find, probably will find, that if you are, very right or left-handed, that one of these sides will be done better or more different than the other side. And that's kind of normal, I think, for a two-sided blade like this. Chisels have a single edge on them, a single. I forget what the style of that blade is called, but it's got the one secondary angle on it instead of the two secondary angles from both sides. So those tend to come out, a lot more consistent, seeing as there's not really a whole lot to compare it to. But with knives, you do have that other side to kind of compare. One other tip that's kind of helpful as well is you can put your thumb down kind of on the edge of the blade, and that kind of helps push down in exactly the right spot that you need in order to apply pressure where you want to sand. It is possible to give yourself a little cut that way, and my hands are so calloused at this point that I'm probably impervious to the sort of cut that would give me, but some of y'all might not have those calluses, so just keep that in mind if you want to try this. I find that it's a pretty reliable way to make sure that the sandpaper is cutting where I want it to cut, but it is kind of risky for your skin. I'm doing a lot of the heavy work with this heavier grit, so this 500 grit. So all of the nicks and things that I'm trying to remove, I'm doing it with this paper and saving the finer grits that I'm going to be using later for actually, really putting the edge on it. Even as it is, the 500 grit is actually doing a pretty good job of sharpening. Okay. So this side actually looks better than the other side as far as the nicks and stuff. And so I'm actually going to come around again, and I'm going to find a fresh spot on this. And I'm going to take just the nose of the knife where that damage was really bad. And I'm just kind of going to go ahead and give it another pass here. Okay. Cool. So the nicks are gone. And you've got a nice edge there to work with for the next steps here. And the next steps are basically just going to be working this down to a finer grit. So going to be flipping this over and getting the 1000 grit side. Now 1000 grit is about as far as you really need to take this, personally, I think. You can go further, and I'm going to be going further today with it, just because, I kind of want to show off a little bit, but also just, kind of show you how well this does. So this is 1000 grit, and 1000 grit is obviously a pretty fine grit. It's still a grip that, in my opinion, can be used for a little bit of shaping. And so this will also help get rid of some of the nicks and stuff that are still kind of present. So you're going to just be doing the same thing, kind of rocking back and forth until kind of feel that edge, just making contact in exactly the right way. And then handling it with two hands. Now, the 1000 grit will fill up quicker, and so you notice that I'm kind of advancing this knife along the paper as I'm moving, and that is because I want to make sure that I'm still on, I'm always on fresh material, because the 1000 grit will really fill up very quickly and it will dull very, very quickly. So I want to make sure that we're getting the most out of it. Okay. Again, wiping off in the direction of the blade. You can do the sandpaper in whichever direction, but the little pieces of blade, the little filings and stuff, that can dull the blade if you kind of just rub that stuff along the edge of it, so it's important not to do that. So you can see maybe that edge is a lot shinier now, and it's still nice and consistent, which is what we want. And there aren't really a whole lot of visible nicks aside from that really bad one. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to flip this over again. This part and the subsequent grits always go a lot quicker than the first one because we're not trying to take care of damage. This is on a magnet, and so I'm going to actually move a little bit further down. So I want that to be a nice flat surface that I'm sharpening against. And you may have noticed that I didn't do the careful rocking thing that time. And that is because I have done this enough to where I can just kind of feel it. You will get to the point, if you do this enough, where you can just kind of feel it and go, oh, okay, it's clicked in. It's in the right spot. And, you're good. But until you're sure of yourself in that regard, it's good to kind of play with it, do that like lifting thing, and really get a sense for what that feels like. Because unless you know what the difference is between having the difference in feeling between having it in the wrong spot to having it in the right spot, you're probably not going to be in good shape for getting it in the right spot. Just kind of randomly. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking my fingers and I'm just kind of touching the edge of the blade. And kind of the reason for that is I'm trying to feel any spots that feel inconsistent. Most of this blade feels really consistent. The only part down here that I feel any difference in is down here. So I'm going to go ahead and take that down a little further. The inconsistency that I'm feeling for is a difference in kind of the sharpness. Again, it's kind of a hard thing to quantify. In doing this, you might find that when you're at this stage, you might put your finger down at various points and you may feel one spot that feels just duller than the rest of the spots, and that's the spot that you want to go in and rework. But at this point, this is all pretty consistent, and so I'm not gonna stress it. The next part is this 2000 grit sandpaper, and for this, I'm actually going to go ahead and remove this piece of sandpaper here, and I'm just going to go ahead and place this on here. Again, I could do this with a screwdriver. The screwdriver does a pretty good job, but it's harder to keep that consistent angle on a screwdriver than it is on a flat sanding surface. So I'm just going to continue doing it this way for the sake of consistency. And as far as like keeping this in place, I'm going to go ahead and plop one of these down, and then I'm going to pull it from this end. It's kind of like a strop, which I'll talk about in a minute, because strops are really, really cool. And again, I'm just going to go ahead and place this down here. 2000 grit is fine enough that we're really not going to be doing a whole lot of shaping with it, but we're just going to be kind of teasing the edge here and kind of drawing an edge out. The point at which I'm using to control this, by the way, is my thumb placed right here. Whatever kind of handle your knife has, right up against the edge of the blade, right at the bottom here, kind of on the blade side, is, I find, the best spot to control it if you're going to do it one-handed. And again, if you're going to do it two-handed, like placing your thumb kind of right at that edge so that you can kind of feel it, or getting exactly the right angle, and then kind of, using both hands to move uniformly like that. It's also good. So again, I'm going to go ahead and do that consistency test, kind of up and down. It feels like up here at the tip it needs a little bit more work, so that's what I'm going to do. These curves in the blades, again, really complicate the job of sharpening a blade. Chisels are way easier to do than knives are. And things like straight razors, things that don't have a whole lot of complex curves, and then the more complex the blade is, ooh, you see that cut right into the paper. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Consistent all the way down. May want to just do a little bit of a quick backwards rush on that, just because we cut through that paper. That may have caused a little bit of dulling. If it did, I can't feel it, but just because I'm going to be a little superstitious here and imagine that it could have. Alright, yeah, and that's almost getting down to like a mirror shine at this point, so that's nice. So again, I'm going to put it down here. My control point, again, is right here at the bottom of the blade. If I'm doing it with one hand. And I'm just going to kind of tilt that blade around until I feel it in the right spot, in that sweet spot. I'm kind of moving it back and forth, kind of moving it a little up and down too. You could do it in circles, you could do it in whatever. What really matters is that you keep it consistent and that you follow the appropriate grits. So you always want to move, to a finer grit, and you always want to make sure that that edge is kept at a consistent angle, because those are going to be the things that really matter at the end of the day with this. Cool. Oh yeah. Now, as it is, for like normal knife use, this is fine. You don't need to go any further than this. 2000 grit is already finer than you would really need to go. The 1000 grit sandpaper would have done you just as, just fine for what most people, are going to do with a pocket knife. Not everything needs to be like a straight razor, able to shave your beard hairs off. But it's really cool when you can get it to shave your beard hairs off. So, anyway, my last step here at the shop with sharpening tools is actually to use my buffing wheel. A buffing wheel is essentially an electric strop, because if you have had any experience with a strop, you might know that it is a piece of leather or denim or canvas that is impregnated with polishing compound. That's what it is. People think, a lot of times that it's just a leather strap, and it's not. It's a delivery agent for this polishing compound that is going to be a much finer grit than even the sandpaper that we were using. And so that is how a strop works. And a buffing wheel basically is a bunch of cotton that is impregnated with buffing compound that's just spinning in a circle instead of just laying there flat. So instead of moving the knife along the strop, the buffing wheel moves around your knife. In Soviet Russia, Strop moves. Yeah. Anyway, so what I'm doing here is I'm actually taking some blue painter's tape and I'm using it to mask the blade of this knife. Because when I take the buffing wheel to it, I don't necessarily want the buffing wheel to polish out the entire knife. I want it to just hit that nice little edge there that I've started creating. I do want this on there fairly tight though, because this paper will kind of move, and so always be careful when you're come rubbing along the edge of a blade. Obviously, you just sharpened this thing, so it's gonna go right into you if it wants to, if you give it a chance. So again, I'm just kind of going along the edge here, masking everything off that isn't that edge that I want to sharpen. Okay. And now this thing is ready for the buffing wheel. So this is my buffing wheel, or at least it's part of it. If you look over here, you'll notice that there's another wheel attached to this, and this one looks a lot less dirty. That is because when you have a buffing wheel for guitar work, you have one side that you use for finish and plastics and things that are non-abrasive, and then you have another side that you use on metal and wood and kind of yucky things that can kind of leave splinters and whatnot in here, because you don't want to be taking a guitar finish to something that has a whole bunch of steel wool fibers or other kind of crazy contaminants in it. But you may want to polish your frets, obviously, so this is the side that you use. This is also the side that we're going to be using for sharpening this knife. So this here is just some color tone polishing stuff from Stu Mac, and you can get this stuff for pretty cheap. I'm going to get this wheel spinning, apply some from the dirty end of this to this dirty wheel, and then I'm going to be taking the knife to this wheel. Now, the thing about buffing wheels that I've talked about in videos in the past is that buffing wheels are really great at grabbing things from you and throwing them across the room. Obviously, that is kind of a danger when the thing it may be throwing across the room is a knife. So you definitely want to be very mindful of all of the buffing wheel safety guidelines, and also, like, you know, make sure that there's nothing on that side of this thing that this is going to throw a knife into and be harmful. So, like, if you have a project, maybe not over there right now. If you have a coworker, definitely not over there right now. But what we're going to be doing, because this spins in this direction, we're going to be putting the knife blade up to it on the bottom here. And the goal here is actually to come in at a pretty flush with the wheel, because the little tiny fibers in here are actually going to be the thing that carries that polishing compound and really does that clean, that licking of the edge that's going to really give us that nice edge. And we definitely don't want to, like, turn it this way, because that edge will get caught in the wheel and will get thrown. You don't want to approach it this way, and you don't want to, like, approach things with your fingers like this. Keep in mind that it's going to be spinning downward, and so you want to avoid anything that could get caught in it in that direction and be, thrown. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and start this up, and I'll kind of show you my technique here. You see how that changes color? That's a good thing. That's what I want to see. I'm going to start with this side. Be very careful approaching that tip. I'm not applying very much pressure at all. Letting the wheel do the work. Okay, so that side is done. Just kind of feeling the edge, I can really feel that this is really starting to get into the sweet zone in terms of how sharp it is. So I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to do the other side. And I'm kind of moving at a leisurely pace here. Notice that I'm not just kind of rubbing it back and forth super fast. The reason for that is that I want to give this thing a chance to let that friction really set in, and for it to really get a chance to polish that edge. If you move too quickly with a buffing wheel, it really doesn't do too much. This thing really depends on time and friction in order for it to do its thing. And you could even stand to go a lot slower than I'm going right now. I'm being a little impatient here. Cool. Oh yeah. Alright. I'm going to go ahead and stop that. I'll show you what I've got here. So you can see all that buffing compound and stuff that's kind of hanging on the edge. Kind of making it look a little dirty, especially in this area here. And that's normal. That stuff kind of sticks. So anyway, the next part of this is going to be removing this tape and demonstrating to you how sharp this knife is. So for removing tape on guitars, generally it's a good idea to use a little bit of naphtha. Go very, very gently, because this stuff will remove finish on your knife. It's not going to likely remove the metal finish, so you can afford to be a little bit more brutal taking that off. But you're still going to have all that gunk left behind by the buffing wheel. A trick to that is going to be a little bit of naphtha or some lighter fluid, some kind of oil-based something. And going to be going in the direction of the blade. Keep in mind also that just because you don't have a buffing wheel doesn't mean that you can't use basically the same technique. Again, a strop, something that you could make with some old jeans or some canvas scrap or whatever you have laying around that can hold buffing compound, you can make a strop for yourself that will essentially do the same thing that I just did with the buffing wheel, except just you'll have to move the knife manually and, you know, do that whole thing. The best strop that I ever had was actually a piece of poplar that I had kind of formed a piece of leather around with the kind of fuzzy side of the leather out, and then I put two little tack nails at both ends kind of holding it down, and I would just take some of the Dremel, like red rouge polish, and I would just rub it on that, and that was what I would use. It was just kind of a handy little stick thing. It was nice because it fit in my pocket too. It wasn't like a huge deal to take that anywhere. Can't remember what happened to that thing. I used to use it in my kitchen for sharpening my kitchen knives. But anyway, so go ahead and I'll see if I can zoom the camera in, but you can see that new edge that was created. You can see how nice and shiny that is, and just so that you know that I'm not bullshitting, I'm going to go ahead and we'll do a little bit of shaving. So, yeah. Could get that down to a pretty nice shave. So this is a pretty effective way to sharpen knives. It's a pretty effective way to sharpen chisels. You know, fish hooks, whatever you got. This technique will work for you. And like I said at the beginning of the video, I don't necessarily want to like discourage people from going out and buying expensive sharpening tools. I have Japanese stones. I love them, and I used to use them really frequently until I decided that this was actually kind of a more efficient and cheaper way to do things. By cheaper, I mean time-wise. It just doesn't take as long to maintain this whole thing as it does to maintain those stones. And again, those stones are expensive. If you go out and you buy like a cheap sharpener, you're going to get a cheap edge. The good sharpeners are always going to be kind of expensive. They're going to be something that you kind of got to put a little bit of money into. And it's important to put a little bit of money into that kind of thing, because the thing is that these non-powered blade tools are some of the most dangerous tools in your shop. Your chisels, for example, are one of the most dangerous things for your hands. I have heard horrifying stories of injuries coming from chisels where people's finger got, gone through 2 fingers and into a third with, a little 1/4-inch chisel because it was just that sharp, or just that dull. To be honest, I think that the dull stuff is honestly a lot more dangerous than the really sharp stuff, because the sharp stuff, as long as you've got good control over your blade, it's going to go and it's going to do a pretty predictable thing. Whereas when you have a dull blade, or you have a blade like this that's long with a few dull spots in it, it may not be very consistent in what it does, and that may be really dangerous for you. These things don't make a lot of noise like band saws and table saws and routers. These things are really quiet, and they will just kind of lurk there in your shop, waiting for their opportunity to take a bite out of you. And when they get it, they'll give it to you. And so it's important to keep that in mind with the maintenance of these tools. So anyway, this is going to go back in my pocket. I may trim some more blackberries on the way to the bus stop tonight, and do a little bit of favor for my local community here, and especially since I'm also a cyclist, I hate getting hit by those blackberry things when I'm going down hills. Anyway, this has been Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington. If you enjoyed this video, again, there are many videos on my channel, mostly having to do with guitar repair, not tool sharpening. And if that is your bag, please go check those out. And if you know somebody who is also interested in those things, linking those around really helps. In the description of this video, I have a link to my Patreon and my Ko-Fi. If you have questions that you would like to submit to me through those sites, I am happy to take questions through those sites. I do ask that people, kick me a little bit of a donation if somebody's going to write me a long email and ask me a lot of questions or keep me on the phone. No offense, I love helping people out, but I've also got to make a buck, guys. Anyway, there's a link to my website down there as well. You can go check that out for my repair prices and all of that stuff. And you can also see a little bit of my work. And kind of there's a page in that website that talks about caring for your stringed instruments. And so if you have some guitars laying around that you want to take good care of, that would be a good place to go. Anyway, this has been Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington. Thank you for watching.